At this point, the Cambrian explosion is a paleontology meme that has bled so far into the pop culture zeitgeist that many people only know about it detached from its context.
It's the Cambrian explosion.
The Cambrian explosion is a real period of evolutionary divergence in animal life, but research over the last 30 to 40 years has now shown it to have not been a true explosion in the overall complexity of life. Life had existed in complex ways before the Cambrian period, and things are increasingly looking like complexity had existed for quite a while. Interestingly, most of the groups to which the animal mascots of the Cambrian belong continue to have their extinction dates pushed closer to today. In other words, these things didn't all poof out of existence after the Cambrian explosion. Despite the divergence of life into forms that we may be more familiar with, plenty of old Cambrian weirdo groups continued on throughout the Paleozoic era, and some even beyond to today's world. One very enigmatic, teeny tiny squishy creature has had an interestingly winding scientific history. It has connections to the Cambrian explosion, but was found in the age of coal and bugs. It was once thought to be the world's first caterpillar, but the newest research has found it to be a completely different handful of world's firsts. Why don't we take a look? This video was made possible with the help of Christian McCall, aka Prehistorica, across most of their socials. They helped proofread the script and made sure everything aligned with what was written in and found in their paper. Links to their socials are in the description and comment section below. If you're a researcher and you are working on a project that you want more attention drawn to, don't hesitate to drop me an email. I can come up with a video to your specifications to release with your research, which should hopefully double the clicks, eyes, or attention. I've done it many times, examples of which can be found in my Researchers Approved playlist. Also, my email is in the description. Now, onto the show. The Carboniferous period lasted from 358 to 298 million years ago, and is characterized by massive global forests that couldn't fully break down due to a lack of fungal enzymes that could eat away the woody shells. This super slow process of mechanical decay and eventual application of pressure and temperature created much of the world's coal deposits. Along with the giant forests were armies of the largest terrestrial invertebrates to ever live, croc-sized amphibians, and all sorts of bizarre weirdos swishing through the waterways. One of the best ways to get a window into different animal groups during this time happens to be an incredibly special fossil deposit located near the city of Morris in Grundy County, Illinois, the world-famous Mazon Creek fossil beds. Yes, that is how you pronounce it, like you lopped the A off of Amazon. This deposit, technically part of the Francis Creek Shale, is a series of beds that represents what was once a lush, thriving bay that saw a continual influx of fresh water from upland rivers. This place would have been quite tropical, with giant tree-shaped and small bush-shaped club mosses, tree-shaped horsetail cousins, and unusual forms of ferns. Fossils are found encased in ironstone concretions and include the hard and soft tissues of animals and plants. People have been collecting these fossils since the 1840s. In 1865, Fielding Bradford Meek and Amos Henry Worthen published a paper on a collection of fossil-stuffed nodules from Mazon Creek in the Proceedings of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. Among the crustaceans and myriapods they described, they also defined a new genus and species of what they tentatively identified as the body of a caterpillar covered in bristly filaments, Paleocampa anthrax, which translates to ancient caterpillar of the coal. Of note is that anthrax, the infection, is named after the carbuncles or boils that occur, as they look like tiny pieces of coal, and the describers of Paleocampa refer to the base from which the bristly filaments come out of as wart-like. Just a fun coincidence. The fossils were found in rock units close to the coal units, hence the actual meaning of the species name. The identification of Paleocampa as a caterpillar would make it the oldest known caterpillar ever found. Butterflies, or lepidopterans, appear in the fossil record around 56 million years ago, about 10 million years after the K-pig mass extinction. Molecular analyses have suggested they may have originated earlier, during the Cretaceous period, and this makes sense since this is when flowering plants saw an explosion in diversity. Interestingly, though flowers didn't exist before the Cretaceous or, latest Jurassic, non-angiosperm plants were doing all sorts of things to get animals to disperse their genital drippings to other plants. Some had fruit-like seed coverings, others had dusty spores, and before the butterflies, other arthropods took up their ecological niche. These were the calligrammatids, a group of lacewings that converged on the body plan of butterflies. They likely fed on the cones and fake fruits of various gymnosperms. However, they showed up in the mid-Jurassic and went out by the early late Cretaceous. Additionally, their larvae were most likely not too divergent from those of living lacewings. I know you've seen an antlion. Lacewing larvae are pretty much various takes on an antlion. Grubby, spiny, hairy, leggy critters that prowl for prey among leaves or beneath the water's surface. So, finding a caterpillar-like fossil rules out it being an insect that converged on the butterfly body plan, making it not actually a butterfly. Just thought you should know, there are also a group of lacewings called moth lacewings that sort of convergently look similar to moths, and these guys originated in the early Jurassic but have survived beyond the calligrammatids being with us today. Despite all this, even the research pair who described the caterpillar as Paleocampa anthrax didn't want to come off as confident that Paleocampa was a caterpillar. Mostly because the fossil itself didn't preserve enough detail to be confident it was a caterpillar, but also because of the whole time displacement thing. They even write that they wanted to name it so it can be cataloged for posterity, since more of them might be found in other coal measure localities, but could not predict if there would ever be an adult form they could connect to this species. This thing would sort of fall into obscurity over the decades, with only the bug paleontologist knowing about it. In his 1868 paper in the Geological Magazine, paleontologist Samuel Scudder re-identified Paleocampa as a worm. Samuel Scudder would publish twice more on Paleocampa 14 and 16 years after the worm paper, respectively, reinterpreting the fuzzy thing as a myriapod, a millipede. This ID is what stuck for the next century or more. Just a weird, fuzzy, or spiny worm or millipede. 99 years after the last paper by Scudder, more specimens of Paleocampa were described from a completely different region of the world, France. Montceau-les-Mines is a mining town in France. It hosts a bunch of coal-bearing Carboniferous aged rock units, some of which coughed up three-dimensionally preserved fossils of plants, invertebrates, and vertebrates. The fossil deposits here represent a mountainous, or at least high elevation, mostly if not entirely freshwater environment, making it similar but mostly distinct to the Mazon Creek beds. 1981 saw a bunch of Frenchies publish on specimens of hairy caterpillar-like animals from Montceau-les-Mines, which were similar enough to previously described Paleocampa fossils to be lumped into the same genus and species. They referred Paleocampa more specifically to the polychaetes, the many-legged swimming annelids related to earthworms. Then, in 2004, a new paper by Friedrich Plagel, Greg Rouse, and Jean Vanier, published in CSIRO Publishing, took another look at all available Paleocampa fossils and found them to belong to the fireworm group, Amphinomida. If you were to compare the fireworms with the various Paleocampa fossils, you could definitely see a lot of general or gross similarities. I wouldn't discount someone seeing them and thinking they were the same types of critters. But now I can finally get to the groundbreaking work that has just been published. 2025 sees the publication of a paper in Communications Biology by Richard Knecht, Christian McCall, or Prehistorica, Zhengjia Sei, Richard Rabidou Childers, and Nanfeng Yu that completely revolutionizes Paleocampa. This prestigious author team took a real deep look at all over 30 specimens of Paleocampa from Illinois and France. They took SEM photographs of the bristle-like spines as well. They found that none of the previous identifications could hold up to the anatomical traits that were preserved in the fossils. In fact, they found it to be something that no one had really gotten around to proving: a lobopod. If so, this makes it retroactively the very first lobopod known to science, predating the Burgess Shale's discoveries by almost half a century. Since there are so many specimens, there is a variety of preservation conditions among them. Some are better than others. The best preserved ones clearly show that Paleocampa is a member of the army of weird creepy crawlies that led to all arthropods as we know them. Bugs, crustaceans, arachnids, myriapods, you know what I'm talking about. Let me cook real quick. You know the term non-avian dinosaur? It refers to all members of Dinosauria, except for birds. This grouping is unnatural because birds are definitionally dinosaurs, but we use it in common parlance, so we know exactly what critters we are talking about. The same sort of goes with the term lobopod. Lobopods are just any critter that is part of the panarthropod group that is not an arthropod, usually having lobopodous limbs or the stumpy ridged accordioned legs you see on examples like Hallucigenia, Thanahita, or Entothyreos. They are all technically most likely related to one another, but in various different ways, just like the different groups of non-avian dinosaurs. Some panarthropods diverged off into different branches and died off, others led to other groups, and those groups led to still living arthropods. As it happens, the best Paleocampa fossils showed the critter had 10 pairs of lobopodous limbs that it probably used to amble about very slowly. The thing had a rounded domed shield over its head, a hardened piece of chitin called a sclerite. It also carried 2 pairs of tentacles on the head. One pair were thick, wrinkly, and long. That's what she said. And the other pair were shorter and smoother. No mouths were preserved in any of the fossils, but mouths have been found in other lobopod fossils, so it probably had just a single sphincter-like mouth hole for slurping up bits of food.
Yummers.
Now that I got the boring bits of Paleocampa out of the way, why don't I discuss the things that are totally in your face? Those spines. What were once thought to be the hair-like spines of woolly caterpillars are actually over 1,000 hollow, septated, ridged, spined, sponge-filled tubes. These tubes are organized in bundles. One bundle was composed of shorter tubes that stuck out of the side of the body, and the other bundle was longer and stuck out of the body at a 45-degree angle at a spot between the top and sides of the body. The critter was organized in such a way that it had a pair of each of the 2 types of bundles on each major segment of the body, so 4 bundles per segment, along with a pair of legs, plus an extra pair of long tubes on the butt. If we take a remarkably close look at those tubes, we will see just how alien they were.
Are you sure?
Under SEM photography, you will see that these hollow tubes are septated. That means there are separations along the inside of the tube, placed at regular intervals. Within each compartment was a spongy material. The outside of the tubes have ridges going up the tube, with 2 to 3 smaller ridges in between them, making them look like Roman columns. The ridges themselves also have blunt triangular spines, pointing upwards and away from the body. The authors liken these spines to shingles. The best part is that these tubes taper slightly at their end, but the tip isn't a spike. Instead, it's a ring of spikes, making the ends look like rook chess pieces. The authors state that this sort of architecture is not seen in any animal, living or dead. What use could these things have had? Well, one of the authors noticed that some of the fossils had a weirdly colored staining around the tips of their spines. To figure out the nature of these stains, they did a Fourier transform spectrometry analysis, which uses lights and mirrors to determine what material something is made of. This analysis found that the spines, the tips of the spines, and the matrix around the fossil were all made of slightly different material. This proved to the authors that the stains were not an artifact of preservation and were a real substance that had been pushed out of the tubes at or after death. The distinct organic signature of the stains was only picked up at the tip of the spines, with the authors stating that this means they could rule out the possibility that the substance moved along the ridges of the outside of the spine via capillary action. The organic signature was most similar to aldehyde chemicals, which is a common chemical used by all sorts of backboneless freaks skittering in the underbrush today. Beetles, moths, and ants, for example. This makes Paleocampa the first lobopod ever found, with the ability to defend itself with chemicals. Whether it did this by injecting that toxin when a predator pushed itself into the spines, or it was just pushed out of the spine to make it inedible, is the speculative part. That would be the difference between whether it is venomous or poisonous. The spongy material on the inside of the tubes likely played some role in getting that toxic ooze up and out of the tube. The authors speculate that the trauma that resulted in the death of the animal may be what caused it to squirt its gunk out, or perhaps that was an involuntary action as a result of death.
Oh, you guys made me eat!
The next crazy thing about a lobopodian identification for Paleocampa involves the depositional environment that buried all of the remains. Let's start with the first instance of Paleocampa, Mazon Creek. The Mazon Creek sediments were deposited by brackish water systems. It was a tropical bay that received freshwater infusion from rivers, streams, and creeks. That's not particularly out of the ordinary, since every single lobopod ever found has been preserved in marine sediments. However, Paleocampa isn't the only piece of lobopodian fossil evidence from Mazon Creek. Though Paleocampa was the only lobopod of its type at Mazon Creek, it was not the only lobopod at all. One terrestrial form was Helenodora, which was either an onychophoran velvet worm or a non-arthropod panarthropod lobopod of some type. Some authors found it to be an early branching marine lobopod, which would not be out of place nor unusual, while others thought it a terrestrial velvet worm, which would also not be unusual. The latest Paleocampa author team think it was more likely to be an onychophoran. The other lobopods living with Paleocampa were the marine Hallucigenia, Carbotubulus, and the velvet worm-like Ileoides, assuming Ileoides is entirely valid, of course, since one is terrestrial and likely drowned and preserved in the muddy sediments at the bottom of the Mazon Creek Bay, and since the other lobopods are marine forms in marine or brackish sediments, the discovery of yet another marine or brackish lobopod, this time hypothetically being Paleocampa, is not out of the ordinary. Before we get to the mystery here, let's go check on the French deposits. Montceau-les-Mines is generally agreed to be a tropical montane freshwater environment. The geology of the locality agrees more with a freshwater system than a marine one. The evidence also seems to point more towards a freshwater system than a freshwater system that is also influenced by a marine system, a la Mazon Creek. Aside from the geology, almost every single fossil critter taken from the locality belonged to groups that were able to live in freshwater environments, except for a few weirdos. One was the horseshoe crab Alanops. Another was misIDs, either a lamprey or a hagfish, and the other is our Paleocampa friend. Alright then, let's go down the list. Alanops is part of the horseshoe crab family called the Belinuridae, which was a major group of freshwater adapted horseshoe crabs, so it's not an outlier. If misIDs is a hagfish, then its place in a freshwater system is a weird outlier. However, if it's a lamprey, something most experts lean towards, then its place in a freshwater system makes complete sense and it's no longer an outlier. So that just leaves Paleocampa. There are worm groups that thrive in pretty much every environment that has ever existed on this planet, but the type of worm that past researchers identified Paleocampa as are restricted entirely to marine habitats, both in the fossil record and the modern biological record. Fireworms cannot live in freshwater environments, and we already know that lobopods are all marine. If Paleocampa can be solved, then it might better align with the confirmed freshwater nature of Montceau-les-Mines. Interestingly, Montceau-les-Mines also had other lobopods. In particular, the French Paleocampa was joined by the velvet worm Antenepatis, which is considered by most experts to be almost or entirely terrestrial. The presence of both the terrestrial Helenodora and Antennapatus at Mazon Creek and Montceau-les-Mines respectively seems to help tip over the idea that Paleocampa is an indicator of a marine environment. It makes perfect sense that Mazon Creek's brackish system had terrestrial, brackish, and marine lobopods, when Montceau-les-Mines also had terrestrial and brackish adapted lobopods. The presence of one lobopod in a freshwater system and that same lobopod in a brackish water system points to the probability that Paleocampa was indeed more than capable of surviving in freshwater systems. The fact that what used to be considered a marine worm was present with a bunch of freshwater or freshwater adjacent animals in a montane freshwater environment that is kilometers away from any prehistoric marine deposits is quite strong evidence that Paleocampa was indeed a freshwater animal. There was also freshwater shrimp, ostracods, amphibious euthycarcinoids, and even the terrestrial Arthropleura. Collectively, these bits of data are hard to argue with. There would be a lot of unparsimoniousness going on to continue to accept Paleocampa as a marine animal. So yes, Paleocampa certainly seems to be the very first instance of a non-marine, non-terrestrial lobopod ever found. This rewrites a good chunk of the book on these weird panarthropods and opens the possibilities up for all sorts of weird freshwater diversity. Before I get too carried away, let me bring in Mr. Man from Animal Planet's The Most Extreme to show you the size of this crazy critter. The largest specimen of Paleocampa measures a whopping 40 millimeters, or 1.57 inches. That's about the size of a standard paperclip. So not entirely out of the woolly caterpillar's league, huh? You don't usually see toxic chemical defenses in giant animals, so it sort of fits that this special lobopod is tiny. Would be one hell of a hard lesson learned to lay a finger on one of these buggers, huh? Thanks, Mr. Man. Now that we have sizes, biology, and history out of the way, what did the author team find Paleocampa to be? Well, lobopod obviously, but were they able to find a good place to put it in an evolutionary tree? Paleoartist and paleontologist Christian McCall worked closely on the phylogenetic analysis for our toxic punk little friend here. And when all of the traits from it were coded into phylogenetic software, he found Paleocampa to be most closely related to Hadronax, a fragmentary critter with long front appendages from the Sirius passet of Greenland. These two act as a group, with their closest relative a currently unnamed lobopod from the Soom Shale of South Africa. This throuple is most closely related to the previously first known lobopod, Achaia, from the Burgess Shale of BC, Canada. All of these critters make up a family, the Achaeidae. This means that non-marine ways of life have evolved 3 times independently among lobopods: tardigrades, velvet worms, and now these Achaeids. The authors cannot rule out that Paleocampa was terrestrial or amphibious, as these sorts of lifestyles did evolve in tardigrades and velvet worms. It remains unknown when this non-marine adaptation occurred among the lobopods, or how commonplace it was among them. Perhaps some known lobopods were also capable of living in fresh water, but just didn't preserve there. I suspect there will be a lot more freshwater forms found in the future. Where do you think they will be found? For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.